Welcome to another Telltale Books video. I'm Greg, and I'm going to join in on something that other people are doing, mainly because I've already started a project to go through all of my artistic influences, because I am an artist and I'm a graphic designer, and I have done book design. And a lot of booktubers all of a sudden, after I put up the first of my art series, and I don't know that that probably has absolutely nothing to do with their decision to do this, but a whole bunch of booktubers have decided to do videos of their top 10 favorite book covers. And I've been watching all of them that I've seen come onto YouTube. It's going to be more than 10. Michael Vaughn did 20. It's probably going to be more than 20. I didn't count out how many I pulled, and there's going to be a lot more that I didn't get because I did this quickly. There's going to be a lot more missing here that I didn't pull to show in this video. I did try to limit myself to one per artist. In a couple cases, I just got a beg out of it. Frank Kelly Fraze in particular, there's way too many of his that are just so important to me. So here we go. I'm going to try to keep it kind of chronological, but I don't know if I'll succeed because I just got stacks of books that were pulled and dropped on, and not really in any good order here. So I gotta dig through, and I'll do a lot of editing so that you don't have to sit through all this. I'm going to start at the beginning. Frank R. Paul. He was Hugo Gernsback's favorite illustrator, I believe, because he did so many of the covers of amazing and later on thrilling, later on wonder stories, which Gernsback edited. He of course did the illustration for the very first issue of Amazing Stories, and he did a lot of great covers. So many. He's another of these that it's really hard to choose one cover that is my favorite. I do have two that are my favorites, and they're the only two that I own actual copies of. There are some others that are definitely my favorites that I don't have copies of, and I'm not going to, in order to try to get close to the rules, I'm not going to pull those up or at all. So the first one is December 1928. Amazing Stories. Frank R. Paul illustration for Jack Williamson's very first science fiction story. And I love this illustration. It's just so cool. It's a very dynamic cover. The way he worked with the Amazing Stories masthead and did it in a way to put this guy in a lot of peril, this very precarious situation where he's falling even though he's firing a gun. It's a brilliant compositional device and really creates the tension of the story. The colors are wonderful, red and green and yellow. Red and green, of course, are complementary colors, and then bringing in the yellow really makes it pop, makes it exciting, makes you want to read this issue, and makes you want to read the story, which is, of course, is the purpose of the cover illustration, to get you to plunk down that 25 cents. So that's number one. I've got a second one by Frank R. Paul that I absolutely have to include, and it is the other early issue of Amazing Stories that I actually own. January, I believe this is 1929. Not seeing where it's saying. It's another Frank R. Paul illustration doing what he does best, destroying big cities with some kind of catastrophe. This one coming of the ice. Here again, the colors, the compositional device make so that the building is falling over. You get the tension, you get the idea. It really sets the stage, and Paul had a wonderful capability of rendering architecture. It's a brilliant, brilliant illustration. I love that. That's great art right there. There were a lot of other illustrators got involved after Frank R. Paul's successful run with Amazing. And then, of course, the great Astounding Stories came along into the picture, and Wonder Stories, and the illustrators were working for those magazines, producing some beautiful artwork. And a couple of my favorites were for early Astounding Stories. Not too early, though. I don't have any of the really earliest Astounding Stories. I've got this one from August 1938. Is a beautiful H.W. Wesolowski cover. And he had this knack with these kinds of futuristic machines and weapons and stuff, and just did some very beautiful illustrations like that. And this is my favorite of his illustrations. It's for Hellship by Arthur J. Burks in Astounding Stories. Astounding Science Fiction, rather. And another of the great early Astounding Stories artists, these are both pre-Golden Age. This one is all the way back to September 1937, and this one is another Wesolowski for E.E. Smith's Galactic Patrol. Just look at the colors of this. This isn't a great painting by itself, but with all the text and the masthead and stuff on the newsstand shelf, this is going to really leap out and grab you and make you want to know what the heck is going on with these weird machines. It's a great, great illustration. So it's two by Wesso. Actually, I was kind of thinking this was Howard Brown, so I got that wrong. Howard Brown was another excellent illustrator, worked a lot for Astounding. I don't have this issue, but my favorite Howard Brown is the one he did for, I believe it's The Shadow Out of Time by H.P. Lovecraft. That's a really cool cover. I love it. And that's my favorite Howard Brown work. Get into the 1940s, and the top illustrator for Astounding Stories was Hubert Rogers. And he did a lot of covers for Astounding. That he did most of the covers from like 1939 through I think 43, 44, something like that. He didn't do all of them, but he did most of them. And this is definitely one of my favorites. This is, of course, for The Roads Must Roll by Robert Heinlein. A great, great illustration here. A lot. You'll notice similarities to the earlier pulp illustrations, but a little more conservative. And that made them very strong illustrations. I absolutely love Hubert Rogers' illustrations because they're perfectly suited to the more sober, scientific style of John Campbell's Astounding. But during the 1940s, not everything um, was styled the way Campbell wanted it. There were a lot of magazines that still did some very pulp style stuff, and the illustrators did some very pulp style illustrations. This is one of the tamer illustrations, and I think it's actually from the 1950s. Yeah, it's actually June 52, but it's by Earl Berge, who was the primary illustrator for startling stories and thrilling wonder stories throughout the 1940s. And Berge was known outside the science fiction genre as a pinup artist, and so all of his, or most of his artwork for the science fiction magazines included the Beach Babe covers. You can criticize these all you want, and you'll be absolutely right, but there's still something about the way he did these that is just fun. It's just cool. It's just, I love it. It's decadent. It's colorful. It's playful. He has some brilliant compositions. Sometimes he had a great imagination, and he did render the human figure pretty well compared to a lot of other illustrators of the time. Now, a couple of illustrators that I don't actually have the issues with are Virgil Finlay and Hannes Bok. Very important illustrators in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s. My favorite Hannes Bok was actually done in the 1960s. It's the cover of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, illustrating A Rose for Ecclesiastes by Roger Zelazny, and it was a wraparound cover. And putting an image of it up next to me, it was a wraparound cover, and it was just beautiful. Reminded me a lot of this Earl Berge as far as the colors and such, but Bach had a style that was all his own, and it was beautiful, and it was very fantastical. It was perfectly suited to fantasy. He illustrated a lot of A. Merritt stuff, and Virgil Finlay also did a lot of illustrations for A. Merritt stories in the magazines. And I'm putting up one of my favorites. Finlay was best known, he did some good covers, but his best work was his black and white work for the interiors of the magazine, and he did a lot of truly great ones, starting with illustrating for Weird Tales. Bach also did Weird Tales in the late 1930s, and working for a variety of magazines through the 40s, 50s, 60s. And Finlay was just noted for his sparkling style of his interior illustrations, this being one of them. And one of the truly, truly great artists to practice science fiction illustration. Now, another of the more pulp style illustrators from the 40s, Robert Gibson Jones, and this is my favorite illustration of his for Fantastic Adventures. This is actually July 1950, illustrating Fritz Leiber's You're All Alone. I love this illustration. That dog, the hypnotic eyes, the girl is startled. She should be a lot more scared, but she's just startled. But then you got saliva running out. I mean, it's just such a whacked out illustration. I love it. I saw that as a kid. I fell in love with it. Now, in the 1950s, you got a number of new great illustrators. One of the best was Ed Emshwiller, who did illustrations all over the place. All the magazines, all the paperback books that were coming out, almost everything you looked at had an Ed Emshwiller illustration, except for Astounding. I think he did one or two for Astounding, but that's it. He did a lot for fantasy and science fiction, though, and this is my favorite of his illustrations. I'm trying to get the glare off of it so you can see it decently. That's the illustration for Robert Heinlein's Have Spacesuit Will Travel on the September 1958 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction. Absolutely brilliant. I love the color, love the composition, love the way the astronaut is crawling along there. Everything about this is just brilliant artwork. I absolutely love it. An illustrator that came around in the 1950s and had a lot of staying power, especially because he did a lot of work for Astounding back in the 50s, and he kept working for Astounding and then Analog all the way through his career. And he had a long career, and he did tons and tons and tons of paperback covers, and that's Frank Kelly Freas. And you know him best for this, which was reworked for the cover of the LP for News of the World by Queen in the 1970s. But this is the original for The Gulf Between by Tom Godwin. This is the original appearance of the original illustration, and it's brilliant. Freas, the look he put on the face of that robot, perfect. It's just amazing. This is a truly great illustration. Doesn't get better than that. But Freas was versatile, and he had a great sense of humor, and he illustrated Martians Go Home for Astounding Science Fiction. This was September 1954, and I absolutely love the look of this Martian. It's just brilliant and captures the story perfectly too, and the way it's looking through the keyhole. And it's such a simple illustration, such a simple composition, but it's so powerful. It's just amazing. Just amazing. Another of the great artists that appeared in the 1950s was not so much an illustrator of the stories as he was an astronomical artist. Matter of fact, a lot of his original paintings are owned by the Adler Planetarium in Chicago. That's the best place to go and see a lot of his artwork. But he did a lot of covers for mostly the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, starting in the 1950s, shortly after the magazine launched, and continuing all the way till his death. He did covers now and again for the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, and this is one of my favorites. This is such a cool illustration. Don't know what planet that's supposed to be. Maybe Mars, maybe Mercury. I don't know. But just the way he did his rocks, the composition he's got, the colors, it just brought the solar system to life for people back during a time when we weren't able to take pictures of all those different worlds. Another of the 1950s illustrators who was very important to me, and he's another one of these super prolific illustrators. His illustrations are all over the place on mostly paperback magazine, mostly paperback books from the 1950s all the way up into the 1990s, and that is Richard Powers. And my first experience with Richard Powers was my first experience with science fiction books, and that is this edition of The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. He later had the opportunity to redo all of his covers for H.G. Wells for Berkeley Books, but this is the cover he did. This was originally done and published in the 1960s. This edition was from the mid-70s. This is the edition that I got a hold of, and I read. This was my first experience with H.G. Wells, first experience with the Time Machine, first book I really finished ever. And his illustration here, I don't know that I think it's necessarily his very best illustration, but for me it has so much meaning, and it is really good. I mean, you've got a thing going on with the Time Machine here, a scene from the Time Machine that most illustrators avoid, and that's when the time traveler goes even farther into the future, to the end of the earth, and the sun is swollen, and there's this weird crab-like creature coming up to him. Very, very beautiful scene in the book, and this is a very, very rich illustration of that scene. I absolutely love it. But I gotta say, not necessarily the best thing that Richard Powers ever did. It just means a lot to me. Another illustrator that got started in the 60s and was very prolific in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and a lot of his work I have difficulty with because it's so simplistic. But sometimes he really knocked it out of the park. And this was one of those times, and the illustrator is Jack Gauguin. Gauguin. Somebody tell me how you're supposed to pronounce that. I've only seen it in print. I really don't know how it's supposed to be said. But this illustration for a Poul Anderson story, December 1975 issue of Analog. It's always been one of my very favorites. So Gauguin is an interesting illustrator in that so much of the time I don't like what he did. But then when he did good, he did really good. Another of those 60s illustrators, but my favorite illustration is actually from the July 1975 Analog. And you're probably going to take me to task for not choosing one of his Dune illustrations, but I'm sorry. I like those illustrations, but they're not my favorites. This one is my favorite John Schoenherr illustration. I think this is incredible. I love, love, love this painting. And another artist, I should have covered him before I got into the 60s, because he actually started illustrating. He dates way back to the 1930s, but he really got going with his career in the 1950s, and he kept working till his death in into the 1990s, I think. And this is the April 1980 fantasy and science fiction. Alex Schomburg. He did actually do artwork for the comic books, and his style is a little bit comic strippy compared to what other artists were doing, but it caused a style that was more lighthearted and fun. And this, you can't beat this. This is an awesome illustration. I've always loved this one of his illustrations. And he did a lot of illustrations very similar to that. He was a great artist. Back to the 1960s, of course, one of the best artists to come out of the 60s was Frank Frazetta. And he, of course, did so many amazing paintings. But my favorite was one that I first came across it in an article about Frazetta, and it was either Starlog or Future Life, I forget which one. But it had this full page with no type over it, and that is the Against the Gods illustration that is on this paperback. Now, this paperback crops it a little weird, and then of course makes it only a little larger than half and has this really ugly looking 1970s type across the top. I don't love the look of this paperback, but the illustration, if you see the illustration, full illustration, full page, it's amazing. It blew my mind. It really inspired me when I was a kid. Really, really inspired me to take an interest in art. I'm going to show you number 3 of Frank Kelly Freas, because his style changed by the 1970s. Somewhere in the 1960s, he started changing things. He started becoming a lot more colorful. And this is from Analog, December 1972, illustrating a George R. R. Martin story. And this is a really good example of his more colorful style that he grew into after the 1950s. And it's such a beautiful painting. This, again, very inspiring, very mind-blowing, really, really affected me. I love this painting. I think it's a great work of art. And then another of those illustrators that actually started in the 1950s, and I love a lot of his 1950s work, but I first came across him in the late 1970s. He did a lot of work in the 50s, mostly for Astounding, and then he kind of disappeared through the 1960s. And in the late 1970s, he came back and did a lot of work for Del Rey Books, including a lot of work for their classic science fiction series. And this is The Best of Hal Clement, one of my favorite. Actually, this is my favorite H.R. Van Dongen story, although he did so many others that are so good. This is just one. I love this painting. It really captures the story. I love that alien, love the colors, love the style of it. A unique illustrator, different from the rest, very different from the rest, has a brushwork that is easy to identify his work from the brushwork, from the composition. His colors in the 70s again became brighter and less muted than what he did in the 50s, and his work is just wonderful. I love all the work he did for Del Rey, but this one in particular really caught my eye. In the 1960s, late 1960s, early 1970s, an artist appeared named Dean Ellis, and he had a more sober style that is kind of reminiscent of Hubert Rogers from the 1940s in his more technical focused, sober approach to illustration, but he had a brilliant imagination, and that was Dean Ellis. And this is his cover illustrating the Marching Morons for the Best of C.M. Kornbluth in the classic science fiction series, which I fell in love with. This illustration is my favorite Dean Ellis. Maybe I'm keeping track of how many I've done. It's really irrelevant. There's so much great work. And there's so much that I'm not even going to cover in here in this video. And you'll just have to keep watching my art series to I'll eventually cover them all. One of the best illustrators of the 1970s, the guy that did the famous illustration for the cover of Larry Niven's Ringworld, Rick Sternbach, and that was one of his earliest works. My favorite, though, is this cover for the July 1978 issue of Analog. Absolutely brilliant artwork. A little bit of airbrushing, a style and a color sense like no other artist of the time, and takes you into space so beautifully. This is such an excellent, excellent cover. And I suppose I'm breaking another rule by showing all these magazines, but so much of the great artwork for the genre is in the magazines. Also in the 1970s, you had Vincent DiFati. And there again, I hope I'm saying that name right. I have no clue. So I'm just spitting it out there, and somebody can correct me if you want. Loved his work. Again, he was more sober, more technical, perfect for analog. He did a lot of illustrations for analog. Lots and lots of book covers. This is my favorite. I seem to have a thing for George R. R. Martin covers, but this is my favorite Vincent DiFati illustration. I actually had a folder for school that had this illustration on the cover. They had this illustration on it. I love this illustration. Really, really. The colors, the movement, the brushwork, but just awesome, just awesome. Very, very much my favorite Vincent DiFati. And then fantasy and science fiction. One of the early issues that I got hold of was this one, the December 1978 issue. David Hardy illustration for a Glenn Cook story. Look at this. Oh my God. That ship rushing into the sea over those sailing ships with the sunset and the I don't know if that's pieces of the ship or meteors falling it down, but so much energy, so much dynamism, so much going on there. Such cool colors, such a brilliant composition. This is a great work of art, guys. This is illustration at its very best. And David Hardy is definitely one of the best illustrators ever. Shortly after that, the January 79 issue, Ron Wolotsky. This is Wolotsky's illustration for Christopher Priest's Paley Loitering. And my first experience both with Ron Wolotsky and my first experience with Christopher Priest, I was blown away. This is an amazing painting for an amazing story, and I was sold on science fiction and Ron Wolotsky and the magazine of fantasy and science fiction forever. These are great. Definitely one of my very, very, very favorite paintings. Another one in the 1970s was George Barr. Mostly did fantasy work, mostly for Daw books. And my favorite George Barr is this one for Star by C.I. DeFontenay. This kind of harks back to Hannes Bach. The style, the grace, the high fantasy feel of it, the elegance of the woman, the beauty of the woman. This is a brilliant illustration, and definitely my favorite George Barr illustration. From there, I'm going to do this one, an illustrator you don't hear much of anymore. In the late 70s, early 80s, he did a few illustrations for Isaac Asimov's science fiction magazine, including this one, which is absolutely beautiful. And then he kind of disappeared, and you never heard from him. I did find him on Facebook, and I started following his page on Facebook, but he rarely ever posts anything. You don't see much. He didn't work for a whole long time as a science fiction illustrator, and then kind of disappeared for a long time, and I don't see any artwork from him anymore. But he was one of my favorite illustrators when I first got into the magazines. I loved this illustration. This is another really great illustration. just the whole concept of the double suns, that ship going around, the guy, the composition, the colors, the rendering, perfection. It's a beautiful illustration. I really wish he would have done more. You can't talk about late 70s illustration without talking about Michael Whelan. Michael Whelan came on the scene in the mid 70s, started doing work for Daw Books again, and branched out and worked for every major publisher, Ace, Del Rey, everybody, because he just had an ability to capture the story that far exceeded anybody else that was working in illustration. And he had a great eye for composition, a great skill of drawing, perfect capability with color. The others that have done these best covers have avoided this cover, but this is always going to be my favorite Michael Whelan illustration. Even though there's so many others that are so brilliant, this one really hit me over the head and blew my mind. This is a great illustration. Just look at the way the figures are drawn and arranged. The moon behind John Carter and Dejah Thoris, the rendering of the columns, the space going up the steps. It's just a great illustration, a great bit of artwork. It's brilliant. And that guy could crank them out always at that level. Again and again and again. Every month you saw 2, 3, 4 Michael Whelan illustrations in the bookstore shelves popping up, and they were all that good. Mind-boggling. But one of the very first book covers that I really took notice of is by an artist that you don't hear much about anymore, but in his time he was very popular. He did a lot of covers for Omni magazine, and he did a whole series of covers for Arthur C. Clarke, and the first one I got a hold of was Earthlight. And this one, pretty simple composition, airbrush rendering, but the way the rendering of the spaceship and the landscape worked with the rendering of the type really impacted me. The colors are great. The composition is great. This is an excellent, excellent illustration. And he did a whole series of illustrations like that for Arthur C. Clarke novels. Now, the classic science fiction series for Del Rey Ballantyne produced a lot of really brilliant covers, a lot of really brilliant illustrations. A lot of them were done by either Dean Ellis or H.R. Van Dongen, but other illustrators got involved too, like The Best of Jack Williamson and this absolutely mind-blowing illustration for Jack Williamson's The Humanoids. On the cover of this book, this is Ralph McQuarrie, the guy that, before he did this, I knew him as the person that did the production artwork for Star Wars, and those were quickly done in a very sparse style, not a lot of detail. And then he did this with such rich, realistic detail, and it's a great composition, and it really captures the robots from the humanoids. This really, again, blew me away. But not to be outdone were the brothers Hildebrandt, who were most famous for their Tolkien calendars and for their poster for Star Wars. But my favorite is the cover of The Best of C.L. Moore for No Woman Born. I love this illustration. The composition, again, the elegance, how it flows, the colors, very rich. The robot, very beautiful, very graceful. Excellent. excellent illustration. Oh, I'm coming to the end of my stack, though there's so many illustrators I'm skipping here. Because there's one that I have the actual object, but it's a little fragile and it's packed away, and so I'm not pulling it out for this, and that is John Berkey. He did lots and lots of book covers, but my favorite is actually not a book cover. It's a poster concept he did for the movie Star Wars, the first Star Wars movie. It was included with the LP record, and I'm putting an image up here of the poster. It was done as a poster and given as a freebie in the original LP 2 record set for the motion picture soundtrack by John Williams. And it's showing, of course, the battle with the Death Star at the end of the movie. John Williams is a science fiction impressionist. His quick, loose brush work rendering these complex futuristic technologies is amazing. He was one of the very, very greatest artists. And then there's Rowena Morrow, who was kind of overshadowed by Frazetta and Boris Vallejo, especially Boris Vallejo, because her style was kind of similar to Boris. A lot of times you had to look carefully to make sure that it wasn't a Boris Vallejo. She did a lot of brilliant illustrations, though, and was a great artist in her own right. And this is my favorite for Bob Shaw's Nightwalk. I love this with the eyes going back to that character in the foggy swamp. Very spooky, very creepy. Really, really cool illustration. I love it. I love her work. I love this. I think this is the best of her work. Boris Vallejo himself, of course, did so much great work. And I didn't dig out my copy of it, but my favorite of his, I'll put it up digitally. My favorite illustration of his is not what he typically did. It's the illustration for Frederik Pohl's Gateway. This illustration is so different and so brilliant, and it actually harks back to some of those H.W. Wesso illustrations from Astounding Stories in the 1930s. And yet it's different, it's new. The spaceships are muscular, of course, Boris Vallejo. It's a brilliant painting, and I feel it's his best. Even though he's not really known for science fiction illustration. Another artist from when I first started reading was Paul Alexander. He is an artist with a very unique style and beautiful, beautiful paintings. Rich renderings, really cool landscapes. His figures are very well done. This one, of course, just has little people on a platform. This is such a great illustration. Again, this is one of the early books I came across and bought and read, and I have to say, I didn't know who Ian Watson was at the time, but the idea of a very slow time machine was compelling, and this illustration was, I had to have it. I had to have it because of the cover. A favorite book, favorite illustration. Doesn't get much better than this. And as I said, there are a lot more. There's some that I'm just not including here, partially because I don't have the books anymore, like Ice Rigger with the Tim White illustration on it. That Tim White illustration is, oh, wow. Great, great illustration. I love it. And Bob Eggleton is missing from this. Absolutely love his work. I couldn't find something in time to hold up to do this video tonight, so I gotta just mention him in passing. I love his work. Great illustrator. Lots of others. Leo and Diane Dillon, Ian Miller. Barclay Shaw. I was looking for my copy of Spider Kiss. I love the cover of Spider Kiss by Harlan Ellison, done by Barclay Shaw. That's, in my opinion, that's Barclay Shaw's best. But I couldn't find that book in time to do this. I got tired of digging through stacks, so I don't have that one up. You know, this is so hard for me to limit to just a small number of great illustrations, because there is so much, and so much that is so much better than what I've seen other people holding up. I don't want to criticize other people or try to take down their opinions, the covers that they love. That stuff's important. It's what is important to them, is what affected them, and so more power to them for loving those. But as an artist, I'm looking at them, and there's a lot of them that I just don't feel are as good as the things that I've held up here tonight in this video. But then, you know, these are ones that I love. We're talking here about what I love, so, you know, naturally it's going to be a different selection. But I tend to go more for full cover illustrations with a lot of rich detail, realism, bright colors, brilliant colors, active compositions. That's what I think is best. That's what I'm drawn toward in artwork, period. The next of my art videos is going to be focusing on the period of from early Christian artists after Rome fell all the way up to about the 1300s. So we're covering over 1,000 years in that one, and that's why it's taken me so long to get to it. At that, and finding decent examples that support my thesis of how the history of art has developed fantasy and science fiction illustration, how there are certain artworks from those early days that still ring down the ages and inform these great illustrators that I've shown you here. And so I'm going to continue that series. The next one is going to be the early Christian through the Gothic period. Big, long time period, but I'm not going to show a whole lot of examples from that time period. Partly because it's hard to get a hold of examples that I can show you. And partly because it's not really my very favorite time period for artwork. I tend more towards the realistic paintings, so when we get into the Renaissance, that's when we start getting into the stuff that really resonates with me. So I hope you'll come back and watch that video and the rest of that whole series, which is going to take me a long time, because eventually I'm going to stop going through periods of art and I'm going to focus on individual artists. Like, I'm definitely going to do a video just on Hieronymus Bosch. You know, and I'm going to do videos on each and every one of these artists I talked about here, and some that I didn't talk about here, and talk about how they have influenced me, affected me, shaped the genre outside of me, and brought us to where we're at today. I hope you'll join me for all that as I do it. It's going to take a long time to complete, but I'm dedicated to it because this is a big passion. Book illustration is a huge passion of mine, and I've always wished that I could be doing stuff like Michael Whelan did, or John Berkey, or Paul Alexander, and just have the opportunities never worked out for me. Instead, I'm doing graphic design. So come back and join me for a lot more videos about the art of fantasy and science fiction. Till then, hit the like button, hit the subscribe button. More to come.